And not to belabor the point, but we are incredibly grateful that every Saturday and Sunday you choose to dedicate a little of your time to coming here to the Battlefield Park. So it means a lot to us. And I'm very excited to talk with you this afternoon about something that I'm fairly passionate about, which is, one, how the veterans of the battle remembered it, how they thought about it, and how that in turn shaped to a degree the experience of visitors who would come to the battlefield in the days, weeks, months, decades, centuries following the battle. And also one particular area of the battle, one particular phase of the battle, the fighting on Culps Hill, which is fought over the evening of July 2nd, 1863 and the morning of July 3rd, 1863. And it's often one of the overlooked areas of the battlefield. But what I hope to do today with you all over the course of the next 60 minutes or so is take a very specific look at that one phase of the battle, the fighting on Culps Hill on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. And then try to pick apart how the men that fought there remembered it, how they thought about it, not in the long term, but in the immediate aftermath. And I have a bit of an agenda today in doing that. And hopefully that agenda will kind of reveal itself over the course of the presentation. But to try to give you a little context of the direction I hope to head in, I'd actually like to start today by going back to 1963. So the centennial of the American Civil War, the centennial of the Battle of Gettysburg. And, many of you no doubt remember 2013, we had the 150th anniversary of the battle, and we were very focused on the fact that in 2013, what we were trying to offer up to the visitor was not a celebration of what happened in 1863 as much as it was a commemoration of what happened in 1863. So it wasn't celebratory. It's tough to celebrate a battle where 51,000 Americans are killed, maimed, wounded, prisoners of war. That was very different, though, from how the centennial of the American Civil War and the centennial of the Battle of Gettysburg was treated in 1963. I wasn't alive in 1963. How do I transition from that? Perhaps some of you were, I don't know. But if you go back and you remember the centennial, or if you research it, it was a very different kind of focus. It was much more celebratory. So we're going to look at the Battle of Gettysburg, and we're going to celebrate it for all those things that make us feel good as Americans. So we're going to look at kind of the mutual heroism and courage and fidelity of the men on both sides. We're going to extol them for their bravery, their belief in what they thought was right. We're not going to delve into those more difficult, contentious, controversial issues, arguably the more important issues, about what the war was over, the consequences, the legacies, etc., etc., etc. This is going to be kind of a feel-good moment in American history where we can celebrate the fact that 100 years after the American Civil War, 100 years after this cataclysmic event in our national past, we can go and we can reflect on the fact that the country has been able to come together. What I did just purely as an exercise is I went through the Gettysburg newspapers in 1963 in June and in July, and I looked at how the centennial was being treated by the local community. And as you can kind of see from the advertisements I cropped out, it was very celebratory, and it was an opportunity in 1963 for the local community to kind of market Gettysburg as this place of reconciliation, this place of healing. And so we have the Gettysburg Garment Company celebrating the North and South coming together 100 years after the war. If you're so inclined, you can go and see Mrs. Sue Knox, the Battlefield Beauty Bar, and get your anniversary hairdo squared away. We have Stonewall Jackson over there on the left. Sure. So it was very celebratory, very celebratory. And for the community of Gettysburg, the 100th anniversary of the battle was an incredibly important event. It was arguably the biggest event to happen in Gettysburg since 1938, since the 75th anniversary. And As usually happens when Americans reflect on the Civil War, Gettysburg occupies a lot of their mental attention. Gettysburg becomes the place where Americans are going to remember that chapter in American history. And again, it was coming off as a largely celebratory exercise. There was a huge programmatic schedule, for lack of a better word, during the Centennial in July of 1963. So if you came to Gettysburg, there were reenactments, there were living history events, monuments were dedicated. Florida, for example, the Florida State Monument is dedicated in July of 1963. There's a reenactment of sorts of Pickett's Charge, which you see there on the left. The Park Service in 1963 took kind of a back seat to a degree. They didn't do a whole lot. They were part of the state and national committees that organized the kind of Centennial celebration. But the only real programmatic exercise or option the National Park Service offered up in 1963 was a series of vignettes that took place across the battlefield. So if you were a visitor, you come to the battlefield on July 1st, 1963 for the Centennial celebration. You could drive around the battlefield park, and at certain stops along the first day's battlefield, you'd encounter these vignettes. And by and large, these vignettes were reflections of how Americans, at least white Americans in 1963, were treating the American Civil War. We're not going to worry about the ugly part, we're not going to worry about the controversial part, but we will celebrate those moments where Americans from both sides are coming together. So again, if you're a visitor, you come to the battlefield in 1963, you drive around the park, you're going to see a vignette on Barlow's Knoll of the Barlow-Gordon incident. So you'd see these living historians and reenactors basically acting out the moment when Confederate General John Gordon finds the wounded Union General Francis Barlow and cares for him. You would go to the shadow of Oak Hill, to the Moses McLean farm, and you'd watch this vignette of the saga of the Schwarz brothers being acted out. Are you all familiar with that story? One is a Union soldier in the 45th New York, the other is a Confederate soldier, presumably in an Alabama regiment. They were both immigrants. They came from Germany. They went separate ways when they arrived in the United States. One fights for the North, one fights for the South, and by a twist of fate, they encounter one another on the battlefield. So they acted that out. And on July 3rd, 1963, if you journeyed to Spangler Spring in the shadow of Culps Hill, you'd see this moment, this vignette acted out where Union and Confederate soldiers, in the midst of combat, as darkness shrouds the hill, filling their canteens side by side at Spangler Spring. It was called Friendly Enemies. And these vignettes were a hit. They were a big deal. The director of the National Park Service actually wrote a thank you letter to all those who were involved, kind of extolling how impactful it was. The Gettysburg Times reported that over the 4 days of the anniversary, 50,000 Americans saw these vignettes playing out on the battlefield. They were a huge success. That being said, not everyone in the 1960s was really pleased with the direction that the Centennial was taking. And now I'll turn your attention to Bruce Catton. Bruce Catton, very famous historian of the Civil War era. He's like my spirit animal, if there was a spirit animal. I love him. I love him. His Army of the Potomac trilogy, if you haven't read it, you absolutely need to. But Catton was concerned about the direction that this Centennial was going, the way that it was taking shape. And he was invited in 1962, so a year before the Centennial commemoration at Gettysburg in 1962, he's invited to speak at Gettysburg College as part of their annual Fortinbaugh lecture. And he spent part of his time at the college talking about what he saw as fundamentally flawed about this Centennial moment at Gettysburg and in the American Civil War. And he has this great quote, which if you'll indulge me, I'll read. Catton said, "If we are not careful, we may become prisoners of the Civil War, prisoners of its romance, of its legendary, of the odd, heartwarming, ever-living impulses, which its people, its flags, its songs, its stories, send tingling down the spine. And there's grave danger that a sentimental haze will cloud the landscape, so that we fail to see the deep, tragic issues and the profound lessons which were involved. Now, this kind of goes without saying, because I gave away how Gettysburg treated the Centennial, but Catton's warning wasn't really heeded. And I would argue that nowhere on the Gettysburg battlefield, with maybe one exception, nowhere on the Gettysburg battlefield does this sentimental haze that Catton warned about lay heavier than here. Spangler's Spring at the base of Culps Hill. This story of these Union and Confederate soldiers in the midst of combat, side by side, filling their canteens, calling out this truce in the midst of carnage, has, at least in my opinion, really hijacked the story of what happened at Culps Hill. And I think it's, again, I think it's a bit of a hijack, because it doesn't really reflect the experiences of the men who fought there. And this story of these Union and Confederate soldiers calling this truce at Spangler's Spring has dramatically shaped how visitors in 1903, 1938, 1963, 2020, it has dramatically shaped how visitors engage with that part of the battlefield. So think about it. You're taking the auto tour. You're a first-time visitor to Gettysburg. There's only one stop at Culps Hill, and it's here. There's only one major parking lot at Culps Hill, and it's here, with the exception of a few spaces at the summit. What I'm saying is, if you're a visitor, you drive to that spot on the battlefield, this story kind of becomes the Culps Hill story. And I think in many ways, it's a very flawed story. And it goes all the way back to the decades immediately following the battle. There's a guidebook that's published around the time of the 75th anniversary of the battle, 1938. It's written by a man named Paul Roy, who was the editor for a time of the Gettysburg Times. And in this guidebook, he writes about Culps Hill and Spangler's Spring. And he writes this: almost at the same time, these soldiers, fighting to kill only a few hours before, found this gushing spring, located between the firing lines. They gathered about its cooling outlet and like brothers in arms exchanged greetings, while waiting their turn to refill their canteens, partook of the waters that proved such a blessing to these heroes suffering from parched throats, thence returned to their respective positions and later engaged in mortal combat. And then he goes on to say, at every gathering of the blue and gray, it's repeated. On a number of occasions, veterans of the Army of the Potomac and those who fought under Lee, who were in the drinking party near Culps Hill, met and exchanged viewpoints as they did upon that memorable night years before. And popular culture has really kind of gravitated towards this moment too. So here are a few of the kind of tchotchkes you can pick up that focus on this moment. We have sculpture over on the right. We have a commemorative plate on the left. We have veterans who were shipped, basically busts to Culps Hill to reenact this moment. The background is a postcard of the spring. And the monument that you see there is actually built by the War Department. So the federal government is building this monument over the spring to kind of commemorate this moment in the battle. The problem, though, is, and this gets to the central theme which I want to talk about today, is that if you go back to the words of the men that fought there, they don't write about it. At least they don't write about it in that way. For the men that fought at Culps Hill and that survived, they wrote about the battle as a trial, as a tribulation, as a moment devoid of gallantry, a moment of bloodshed and human filth. And that was what they focused on in the immediate aftermath of the battle, not this kind of fanciful moment in the midst of the combat where these two sides are engaged in this quasi-truce over the spring. So what I want to do for the remainder of our time together is take a deep dive and look at the words of the men themselves and see how they viewed the fighting on Culps Hill. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the meaning they associated with it. So we're not going to talk about Culps Hill in terms of the Union victory. We're not going to talk about Culps Hill in terms of how veterans memorialized the battlefield. We're going to confine our focus to those days, weeks, months, and in some cases years immediately following the battle, and what they wrote about it. A note on sources. I'm going to try to limit as much as I can the sources I share to those who fought the Hill and who survived, obviously, but those who were in the Union Army. Now, I do that simply because there's far more Union sources than Confederate sources for this phase of the battle. Even Harry Fons, who wrote his book on Culps Hill and Cemetery Hill, kind of lamented the same thing. There's not a whole lot of great Confederate sources. I'm going to interpret the word veteran fairly broadly, though. So I'll talk about the men that actually fought in the breastworks, but I'll also talk about some of the nurses that worked at Camp Letterman who came to the Hill in the months following the battle. I'll talk a little bit about John Batchelder, the first kind of official historian of the Battle of Gettysburg, and how he remembered the fighting on Culps Hill. So I interpret it fairly broadly. But what I hope you'll walk away with at our conclusion is a very different picture from those Union and Confederate veterans filling their canteens in the spring. So, for a bit of context, I assume we're all familiar with Culps Hill. Culps Hill is located just kind of southeast of Cemetery Hill. It is entirely wooded with two exceptions. One, what we call Pardee Field today, which is kind of open meadow on the lower summit of the hill, as well as Spangler Spring, which is kind of at the barb of the hill at its far southern tip. It is bordered to the left by the Baltimore Pike, and to the right by that waterway you see, which is Rock Creek. It is, to call it Culps Hill is actually a bit of a misnomer. It's actually two hills. There's an upper summit and a lower summit. It's owned by the Culp family and the Spangler family, respectively. In terms of the overall kind of picture of the Union effort during the Battle of Gettysburg, Culps Hill is vital, vital terrain. If Confederates captured Culps Hill, that means the Union position at Cemetery Hill is untenable. It means that the Baltimore Pike, which is a line of supply, retreat, communication for the Union, that's cut, that's threatened. So if you're in the Union Army of the Potomac, you want to win the Battle of Gettysburg, you absolutely have to hold on to that terrain, Culps Hill. The Union troops that will fight on Culps Hill are primarily from the 12th Army Corps. They're commanded by a man named Henry Slocum. And by and large, they're veterans. By and large, they're veterans, with the exception of really one brigade of Maryland and New Yorkers. They are men that had fought at Antietam. They had been engaged in the Shenandoah Valley. They fought at Chancellorsville. They're good troops. They're veteran troops. And the same is true for the Confederates that will fight at Culps Hill. Edward Johnson's division. These are men that had fought in the Shenandoah Valley, that have been engaged in a number of campaigns. So these are men that know what their business is. You don't have a whole lot of fresh recruits fighting on July 2nd or 3rd at Culps Hill. First Union troops to occupy Culps Hill are the men of the 7th Indiana. They occupy the hill the evening of July 1st, 1863. By the morning of July 2nd, 1863, the entire 10,000 men or so, the 12th Army Corps, will occupy the hill. And they begin to create breastworks. These breastworks are very important to the story of the battle on Culps Hill. Many, many Union soldiers will write about the creation of them and how prominently they impact the overall course of the battle. And initially, at least one Union general, John Gary, argued against building any kind of breastworks or entrenchments on Culps Hill. Gary was of the opinion, and he's a division commander in the 12th Corps, Gary is of the opinion that you build up breastworks and allow your men to fight behind it, they're going to be no good as soldiers. They won't want to fight out in the open ever again. George Green, who's a brigade commander under Gary, and an engineer at that, basically says, the heck with that, I'm going to dig in. And so that's what his men do. And they create this snake-like breastwork that winds its way down the hill. One of the men involved described it as almost like a crib-like structure, where they're piling up rocks and earth and logs, in some cases even a head log, to create these very formidable works. Well, what happens on July 2nd is most of the 12th Corps, by the afternoon of July 2nd, is shipped off to the other end of the battlefield, because that's where the threatened point is, Little Round Top, the wheat field, the peach orchard, leaving only one brigade, a little over 1,500 men under George Sears Green, to hold the hill. That evening, Confederates in vast numbers attack the hill, and they come this close to driving the Union defenders off Culp's Hill, severing the Baltimore Pike, and capturing that key terrain. And arguably, it's only because of those breastworks that these Union troops are able to fend them off. The battle continues the next morning, the 3rd of July. Begins about 4:30 in the morning when Union artillery on Powers Hill will shell Culp's Hill in an attempt to drive some Confederates who had been able to gain a bit of a foothold in the lower summit, to drive them off. And that'll inaugurate what is arguably the most sustained combat of the entire Battle of Gettysburg. It happens the morning of July 3rd on Culp's Hill, where you have these two opposing forces basically battling for control of that key tactical position. And with only a few exceptions, the Union Army is able to mount a gallant defense. Confederates launch fruitless assault after fruitless assault, and by midday the fighting on Culp's Hill is over, and Union forces have been able to hold on to the hill. And in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the 3rd and then the 4th of July, the main focus for at least the Union troops who fought there was on basically cleaning up and taking stock. And it became, I think, fairly apparent early on of the momentous nature of the fighting that happened on Culp's Hill and the ferocity of the fighting that happened there. So, for example, John Gary, in his report of his division and their involvement on the hill, he would write that they fired some 277,000 rounds of ammunition during the fighting on Culp's Hill. Now, if you use that number as kind of a baseline and extrapolate for the other Union divisions and Confederates who were involved in the fighting, it's not out of the realm of possibility that close to 800,000 rounds of ammunition were fired on July 2nd and 3rd on Culp's Hill. The human cost of the battle was fairly steep as well, more steep for the Confederates. Of the roughly 10,000 Union troops involved in the battle, as many as 1,082 were casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. For the 9,000 Confederates who had to assault up the hill, their casualties numbered somewhere in the vicinity of 2,800. So it was a costly battle. And at the end of July 3rd, the battle kind of shifted from a lived event to a remembered event. The first accounts that we have from Union soldiers who fought at Culp's Hill, the first accounts we have are usually dated around July 5th and July 6th. By this point, most of the burial of the dead is over, and the 12th Army Corps is marching south and then southwest in pursuit of the Confederates. They're encamped at Littlestown, Pennsylvania, and that's where a lot of the initial Union accounts come from. This brief halt at Littlestown, where for the first time the survivors are able to write home and say, hey, I'm alive, and here's what happened. And I've looked a lot at kind of these early letters from the battlefield. They all take a very similar color. It's these men, as rapidly as they can, writing off a little note to their families back home saying they survived. But when you look at these and you dissect them, a couple of themes emerge. One, these Union troops who survived the battle on Culp's Hill are physically exhausted. They're beat. They've been up, many of them, for multiple days. They're exhausted and they're hungry. And a great example of that is George Cobham, who you can see up on the screen there. He would write home and say, I write you a few lines in haste to let you know that I am quite well. We have had one of the most severe battles of the war at this place. The fighting lasted 2 days and resulted in a complete victory on our side. I passed through it without a scratch, although much exposed all the time. And he would actually go on to write about how physically exhausted he was, writing about how he hasn't changed his clothes in multiple days, how he hasn't slept in a long time, but he wants to let his family know that he's alive. Most Union soldiers who fought at Culp's Hill and who survived had absolutely no idea what was going on, other than that they hadn't lost and that the victory was an incomplete one. A young man from the 137th New York would write to his family back home, and he said, "I can't tell what is going on now, so I will not try, for we hear so many rumors." General Cobham, who I just showed you a moment ago, would write home and say, "I think the rebels will make another stand before long at some point between here and the Potomac." And again, the sense of the unknown comes through as these men write about what they experienced. But again, they're physically exhausted. To get back to that quote I was talking about from George Cobham, here's the full version of it. He would write to his mother on July 5th and say, "We've had 19 days of severe marching through heat, dust, rain, and mud, night and day, and marched directly onto the battlefield. Fought for 2 days and 1 night without anything to eat or either sleep or rest. I have not had my clothes off or my boots off since I left Leesburg, except once for a few minutes to change my shirt and socks." So these guys, they're physically exhausted, they're thankful to be alive, and they have no idea what's going on. Now, those are the men that got to leave. Those are the men that fought, that survived, and passed through that crucible unscathed. For those men who were wounded during the fighting on Culp, their experience was much, much different. One of the best accounts I've ever read of what it was like to be wounded during the Battle of Gettysburg comes from this gentleman, Joseph Irwin, Company B of the 29th Pennsylvania. And he would write about his experience in his diary. And I'll share it with you in some detail just because I think it's so good. So Irwin is a member of a regiment who was ordered off Culp's Hill on July 2nd in the afternoon. And then he's sent back to Culp's Hill that evening in darkness. Now, he's supposed to just basically go back and occupy the position where his regiment was earlier in the day. But of course, battles aren't static. They change. The battlefield evolves. And so, unbeknownst to Mr. Irwin, the spot he's supposed to go to is now occupied by Confederates. And when his regiment approaches Culp's Hill, Confederates do what Confederates do. They open fire on him. And he's hit. And Irwin would write this. He wrote, "I received a ball which entered the backbone of the hip, grazing the spine, passing through the stomach, and lodging under the skin about 2 inches above the navel. I fell forward on my face. My musket flew out of my hand and I was helpless. After trying in vain to get on my feet, I gave it up and lay quiet. I could get up on my hands and knees, but not on my feet. I had very little pain. The ball and passing through mostly caused a warm sensation." And what he's writing about, I think, really is the immediate shock of being hit and that moment before the pain has really set in. He'll be transported back to the 12th Corps Field Hospital, and during the movement from Culp's Hill to that field hospital, he would describe the experience like this. He said, "I now began to feel a great deal of pain. My stomach swelled up and I could breathe, but with difficulty. I suffered torture on the way there from the jolting over the rough road and did not expect to reach the hospital as I was swollen up a great deal and nearly suffocated, and it was with much difficulty that I could breathe." He isn't treated until the 3rd of July, when he writes, "After a great deal of coaxing, I got one of the doctors to extract the ball from my stomach, which gave me a great deal of relief." So the experience of being wounded was very different, obviously, from the experience of a soldier who was able to leave Culp's Hill. Perhaps the most famous case of a wounded soldier following the battle, at least in terms of Culp's Hill, was this gentleman, George Warner, Company B of the 20th Connecticut. And George Warner is actually a case of friendly fire. He's at the base of the lower summit of Culp's Hill, and behind him, across the Baltimore Pike on Powers Hill, are Union batteries. And they're firing over the position of the 20th Connecticut with shells, trying to drive the Confederates off the lower hill. Well, invariably, some of the fuses on these shells would go off too early, exploding over the ranks of the men of the 20th Connecticut, one of which struck George Warner. In the regimental history of the 20th Connecticut, they would describe the trial of George Warner like this. Private George Warner of Company B lost both arms by the bursting of a shell from one of our batteries in the rear. He was carried to a field hospital near the... Strange to say, he was unaware that he had lost but one limb until coming soon under the hand of Surgeon Terry, when he coolly remarked, "Why, Surgeon, I've lost my right arm too. I thought I had only lost my left." Notwithstanding the magnitude of the misfortune, that which for rendering a human being helpless one can scarcely conceive of a greater, the poor fellow bore up bravely under it, so that even to this day, and this is being written in the 1880s, even to this day, by his industry as an agent of sale of various articles of merchandise, he has comfortably supported his family. So this poor guy is the victim of friendly fire on Culp's Hill, and the shell took off not one arm, but both arms. He would also be remarked upon by a young nurse at Camp Letterman, a woman by the name of Anna Holstein. And she would write about kind of the fortitude that Warner exhibited at the hospital. She would say, "It is very rarely that our brave Union soldiers complain or bear impatiently their wounds. On the contrary, they endure suffering with a heroism which exceeds even the bravery of the battlefield." George Warner of the 20th Connecticut was a case in point. While in the act of firing his musket, a shell exploded, which took off both arms near the shoulders, inflicting also serious wounds in his head and leg. He was uniformly cheerful with it all. Sometimes would despond for a moment when speaking of his wife and children, but the cloud was of short duration, and the pleasant thought of how his little children would wait upon him seemed to reassure him. You know, if anything, when you read accounts of the battle, there's a complete lack of what you would call meritocracy, if you will, for lack of a better word. And by that I mean some men who suffered horrific wounds, who you think surely will die, survive. And others who suffer relatively minor wounds end up succumbing to them. So Warner lives with the loss of both arms, but case in point is a Captain Thomas Fox of the 2nd Massachusetts. And the 2nd Massachusetts was one of the early regiments to come out of the state. They had a lot of what I would call kind of blue-blooded Boston aristocrats among their ranks. Robert Gould Shaw, for example, is originally in the 2nd Massachusetts, a lot of Harvard grads. And on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, through a battlefield miscommunication, the 2nd Massachusetts, and Captain Fox, who you see in the picture there, the 2nd Massachusetts and the 27th Indiana are ordered to basically undertake this suicidal charge across Spangler Meadow, right past Spangler Spring, towards Confederates on the lower hill. And everyone who's about to embark on this charge knows it's a mistake. The colonel himself would say, well, it's murder, but it's the order. And one of the casualties, and it's a disaster, one of the casualties is Captain Fox. Now initially, he describes only a minor wound, and his prognosis is fairly optimistic. Captain Fox would write on July 4th, 1863 to his father, and he would describe the battle and his wounding. He wrote, "Dear Father, we have been keeping the 4th a day or two early this year, earlier than usual, with any quantity of fireworks. The 2nd was engaged the night of the 2nd and the morning of the 3rd. My ankle joint is shattered a little, and the doctor says it may be stiffened. My own opinion is that I shall recover entirely. I shall come home as soon as possible and bring my man to take care of me on the road. We have whipped the Rebs well. John is unscathed. In haste, yours truly, Thomas B. Fox." So he's hit in the ankle by a Confederate bullet. Initially, he thinks he's going to survive. He's going to recover. He's sent home. He makes it all the way to Massachusetts, to his home in Dorchester, which is just south of Boston. And it's in Dorchester that infection sets in. And weeks following the Battle of Gettysburg, Thomas Fox succumbs to his wound that he received on July 3rd, 1863. And his local newspaper would publish his obituary. And they describe it as thus: "The wound which caused his death, a ball in the ankle of the left foot at the Battle of Gettysburg. It exhibited at first no dangerous symptoms, but the previous strain upon the nervous system had been too great. Fever supervened, and the iron constitution which had carried him into the war, worn and shattered by the hardships and fatigues of one short year, refused to rally from the deep prostration. His death was due to sheer exhaustion of the animal frame. It seems impossible that the heart of valor and the body of strength and the living boundless force which we knew a few months since and called by his name, can so soon be cold. We advance no extraordinary claim on his behalf, but we dare think that no one has perished in these wars who was every way more fit to live. In a certain sense, Fox is lucky in that he gets to die at home. So if you've ever read This Republic of Suffering, which is a wonderful book that examines how Americans in the mid-19th century thought about death, the author spends a lot of time describing what a good death is. So in the mid-19th century, a good death means you die at home. You die surrounded by your loved ones. When you pass, you're buried in your hometown, in your family cemetery. Words are spoken over your grave, and your family gets that kind of closure. You yourself make your peace with God before you expire, and that, in the mid-19th century, is a good death. So in a certain sense, Captain Fox is able to die that good death. But the vast majority of men who fall at Culp's Hill are not afforded that same luxury, for lack of a better word. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the one single thing that men write about more than any other, at least among the men of the 12th Army Corps who are on Culp's Hill on July 3rd and July 4th and July 5th, is the dead. The hillside is literally covered with carnage. And it's the responsibility now of these men in the 12th Army Corps to clean it up, to bury the dead. And when these men write about that experience, they write about it in terms of filth and disgust and human waste. So George Cobham, who I've quoted a number of times, would write to his brother, not his mother, his brother on the 4th of July from Culp's Hill and say this: "The slaughter was terrible on their side, and we have not all escaped. All around me as I write, our men are busy burying the dead. The ground is literally covered with them, and the blood is standing in pools all around me. It is a sickening sight." Again, just to remember, these men are veterans of Antietam and Chancellorsville, and this is how they're describing Culp's Hill. The men responsible for burying the dead, these men of the 12th Corps, they'll bury their comrades in a single shallow grave, usually, with a headboard marking who they are. Confederates, by and large, are buried in mass graves. And after, again, remember, it rains on July 3rd and July 4th and July 5th. The rain soaks the ground. Everything is covered in mud and blood, and these poor men who are having to bury these Confederates are just covered in filth. One man, Samuel Lusk, of the 137th New York, would write, "The firing ceased on the 4th, and we buried the dead. We buried the dead of the whole brigade in one burying ground. They were buried about 2 feet apart. We were a hard-looking set of fellows when the battle was over. Our faces were as black as coal. Our clothes were covered with blood and dirt, and some places in the trench the ground was saturated with human blood." S.R. Norris, who was a soldier in the 7th Ohio, would describe the experience after the battle to his family, and he would write, "I have just returned from being one of the pallbearers to the largest funeral I have ever attended, having been detailed to help bury the rebel dead in front of our brigade." He says, "We dug a trench into which we piled about 200. Perhaps the most evocative account of the burial of the dead comes from a Pennsylvania soldier, C.H. Blanchard of the 111th Pennsylvania, who fights in the lower summit of the hill. He would write many decades later, actually, of the battle, and say, "I saw some strange and pathetic sights. I saw a Confederate soldier that a ramrod had passed through his body and pinned him to a tree. But the incident most vividly stamped upon my mind was where I saw 180 Confederates put into a trench. Whiskey had been issued to the brigade pioneers, as the stench was almost unbearable. There was a big red-headed chap from the 29th Pennsylvania regiment, went by the name of Reddy. The last one put in the trench was an orderly sergeant. Reddy came dragging him by the legs, threw him in, and said, 'There, damn you, call the roll and see if they are all there.'" When I read accounts like that, there's almost this dehumanizing aspect to it, in which, as difficult as it might be to become hardened to sights like this, that's exactly what's happening with these men, as they're just dealing with body after body after body. But every now and then, something comes across that kind of reminds men of that innate humanity. And in the case of Thomas Kane, who was a brigadier general commanding a brigade in the 12th Corps, who was very sick during the battle, he would write many years later to Peter Rothermel. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, but Peter Rothermel is an artist. And this artist is creating a giant mural, a painting of the fighting on Culps Hill the morning of July 3rd. And he actively sought the input of veterans who had fought there. And so the artist writes to Thomas Kane and asks him, what does he remember about the battle? And Kane, rather than writing about the tactics or the human toll, he wrote about a dog. And Kane wrote this to Rothermel on March 21st, 1874. He writes, a pet dog belonging to a company of the 1st Maryland, Confederate, charged with the regiment, ran ahead of them when their progress was arrested and came in among the boys in blue. At first he barked in valorous glee, but later I saw him on 3 legs, going between our men and the men in gray on the ground as though looking for a dead master, or seeking to find an explanation of the tragedy he witnessed. He licked someone's hand after being perfectly riddled with bullets. Regarding him as the only Christian-minded being on either side, I ordered him to be honorably buried. I think that that Christian-minded being, I italicized that just to draw your attention to it, because I think it says a lot about how Kane, at least, is viewing the battle, in which there's this absence of Christian charity as these two sides are really doing their best to kill one another. And I think a lot of times that's lost on people. We have this image of the American Civil War sometimes as this chivalrous war, as this gentleman's war. But when I read these accounts from Culps, that's not really what I walk away with. What I walk away with is that these men are doing their best to kill one another. They're trying to kill one another as much as a United States Marine and a Japanese soldier are trying to kill one another on Okinawa, or a member of the 101st Airborne and the German Army are trying to kill each other at the Battle of the Bulge. That's what I walk away with. And Union soldiers who write about the battle, they say the same thing. They're doing their best to kill one another. One soldier in the 66th Ohio, William Stair, would write home and say, "Oh, you had better think we give them what they need this time if they never got it before. Well, I could not say that I killed one myself, but I can say that I shot enough at them. I only fired of upwards of 90 rounds at the rascals. I done my best to kill 2. And that's echoed by an account that a man by the name of John Wells would write home. He says, "You asked me how I spent my 4th of July. We celebrated the 3rd all day, killing Rebs." And men at Culps Hill died in a multitude of ways. And some of you may be familiar with this account. And it's a little bit later than the other accounts that I've included. This comes from the dedication of the monument to the 147th New York in Pardee Field. And monument dedications tended to take on this kind of very ceremonial air in which the veterans would march out to their monument, a band would play, poetry would be read, and invariably one of the veterans was asked to give kind of the keynote speech. And this comes from the keynote speech of Captain Joseph A. Moore, who, in describing the role his regiment played during the fighting, remembered this one moment that had stuck with him. And he, in front of his comrades, said this. He wrote, "Another wounded man in our front was observed laying on his back, reloading his gun. And our men, surmising that he intended to shoot at them, raised their guns to dispatch him before he could have the chance to fire. But by persuasion, they desisted. The wounded rebel was watched when he deliberately placed the muzzle of his gun under his chin and with his ramrod forced the trigger and shot himself through the head." So, the Union soldiers that fought there, they wrote about. They wrote about death. They wrote about being covered with filth. They wrote about killing rebels. They wrote about men who were victims of friendly fire. They wrote about dogs, innocents, being killed in the fighting. And a lot of times they wrote about the destruction of the natural environment. And ironically, that is one of the things that attracted the early visitors who came to Gettysburg. You could go to Culps Hill, and you could tell that a battle had been fought at Culps Hill, because this storm of iron and lead seemed to have swept across the two hills, leaving this path of destruction in its wake. So it was very vivid. and it was very kind of tangible. Frank Haskell, the soldier you see depicted in the photograph, he didn't fight at Culps Hill. He's in the 2nd Army Corps. He's an aide on the staff of John Gibbon. But he traveled the battlefield in the immediate aftermath, and he wrote about what he saw at Culps Hill. He wrote, "Along the slope of Culps Hill in front of the position of the 12th and the 1st Division of the 1st Corps, the trees were almost literally peeled from the ground up, some 15 or 20 feet. So thick upon them were scars that bullets had made. Upon a single tree, in several instances not over 1.5 feet in diameter, I counted as many as 250 bullet marks." So imagine how much fire has to be passing over the battlefield for that to happen. And he writes, "These works looked formidable, zigzagging along these rocky crests even now, when not a musket was behind them. What madness on the part of the enemy to have attacked them." Another man, who's actually an amateur reporter, his name was Isaac Moorhead. He comes a year later, 1864, and still, a year following the battle, he's still in awe at the physical destruction he can see on the hill. And he writes for his local newspaper in Erie, "And how shall I describe this place? The desperate character of the fighting is seen and registered on the trees and rocks. All over the trunks of those trees, for 20 feet above the roots, are marks of fierce musketry. You cannot lay your hand over many of the trees without covering the mark of a minie ball or a wound from a shell. Huge limbs swinging by a few tendons, wounded and disfigured by shell, all over the ground here and everywhere, in the woods, in the roads, in the fields, on the mountainside, are scattered the vast debris of armies." As I mentioned earlier, if you're an early visitor to the battlefield in 1863, 1864, 1865, one of the areas that you really gravitated towards was Culps Hill. It's easily accessible by town, and unlike some other parts of the battlefield, you could go there and you could still see the breastworks built by the armies, these trees that are just peeled from rifle fire. And John Batchelder, who's the first real historian of the fighting on Culps Hill and of the Battle of Gettysburg, would write about it, and he would write about it in much the same language that those other two accounts that I shared wrote about it. You can go and you can see this scar still on the natural landscape from the battle. I think the most vivid account of the Battle of Culps Hill in the immediate aftermath and the destruction, both natural and physical, wrought on the hill, comes from the diary of a nurse who was working at Camp Letterman. Her name is Nia Buckland. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But she would, every now and then, leave Camp Letterman and take jaunts across the battlefield. And once she went to Culps Hill, and she leaves a searing account of what it was like to explore that part of the battle, that part of the battlefield. She writes, "I visited the battleground on several occasions, the first time soon after the conflict, when evidences of the horrid carnage which had ranged over it lay on every hand and in fearful sights. Earlier in life, it would have been almost impossible for me to walk over such a field of horror, but I had grown familiar with death in every shape. Yet when, right above my head at one place so close that it touched me, hung a sleeve of faded army blue, a dead hand protruding from the worn and blackened cuff, I could not but feel a momentary shudder. Boots with a foot and leg, putrefying within, lay beside the pathway. Ghostly heads, too, over the exposed skulls of which insects crawled, while great worms bored through the rotting eyeballs. Astride a tree sat a bloody horror with head and limbs severed by shells, the birds having banqueted on it, while the tattered uniform stained with gore fluttered dismally in the summer air." Here you see a photograph of a veteran of the fighting. His name's Captain Jessie Young of the 60th New York. That's Green's Brigade. And he would visit the battlefield again and again and again. He lives a fairly long life. And what I found interesting about his account is he describes one visit to the battlefield many years later. And he walks along where his regiment fought at Culps Hill. And he notices everywhere he remembers a man having been killed and blood spilling into the earth, this peculiar red berry would grow there. His account you can see on the screen there. I noticed that just where I know men had fallen and their blood had flowed out upon the ground, berries of a particular red color were growing, and they were not growing anywhere else. For instance, I could tell exactly where William Murphy was shot as he tried to roll over the log breastworks to our side, but was taken on the fly, as it were, by a rebel not 3 yards away with a bullet to the brain and rolled back to the other side. And right out of that spot, the berries were growing luxuriantly. And he would reply, or he would mention that he comes years later and they're not there anymore. But that sight of everywhere he knew a comrade had been killed, these red berries growing out of the ground, stuck with him. You know, one thing that the veterans really didn't write a whole lot about was filling their canteens at Spangler Spring with Confederates in the midst of the battle. There are virtually no accounts, none, that I've ever read, maybe John you've read, on the Confederate side describing anything like this. None that I've ever seen that date from around the time of the battle. There are a few accounts from the Union side that talk about the spring, that write about it. But when they do, you don't get the sense that they're talking about this moment where there's this mutual truce and this fraternity. What they write about, and what you walk away with is they're really confused and they're scared. And these are moments of tension, not of truce. A great example is the quote that I have up on the screen there, written by Joseph P. Machette of the 46th Pennsylvania. This is one of the regiments returning to Culps Hill on the evening of July 2nd to reoccupy their old positions, and now they're stumbling into Confederates everywhere in the darkness. And he would write of a Captain Selfridge of Company H, who had taken some of his men's canteens and gone ahead to Spangler Spring to fill them. When he discovered, quote, Johnny's also there, filling their canteens, he backed out with the best grace he could command and reported it to the colonel. So you get accounts like that. Not a whole lot of those more collegial accounts of these men calling this truce in the midst of the battle. And if anyone was so inclined to really delve into this in the early years of the battlefield park, you'd find a lot of licensed battlefield guides and government historians trying to debunk this idea of this truce happening in the middle of the night. W.C. Storick, who writes a guidebook in 1932, who's a licensed battlefield guide, very succinctly sums it up this way. He says, the story that a truce was entered into between the opposing forces on the night of the 2nd, and that they met in large numbers at the spring to get water, is a mistake. The captured and wounded of the Union forces were allowed access to it, along with the Confederates who were there at that time, but there was no truce. Fred Tilburg, who's a park historian, in 1940 would write this. He says, it's often said that the soldiers of the Federal and Confederate armies fraternized at Spangler Spring during the night of July 2nd. There is not sufficient evidence to support this statement, and it appears to be based largely on assumption. Nevertheless, the War Department, who in 1895 assumed control of the battlefield park, and who are very focused on bringing the country together and marketing Gettysburg as a place of reconciliation and healing, they really jump on this notion of this moment at Spangler Spring, and under the guidance of Emmer B. Culp, create the little enclosure that you see there today. And in bronze, it still says, this spring supplied Union and Confederate soldiers with water during the battle. One country and one flag, the strife of brothers is past. I found one account of the spring that I thought is much more indicative of the way in which the soldiers viewed it and remembered it. And so I'll kind of conclude with this story. And it comes from Silas Gardner of the 3rd Wisconsin. This is Ruger's brigade, or Colgrove's brigade, rather. And Gardner, many years later, would write about a man in his regiment, a man by the name of Abner Webb, and some heroics that Webb would perform in Spangler Meadow on the 3rd of July. Gardner would recall a wounded soldier in the middle of the meadow, this is during the day, on the 3rd, crying out for water. And he would say, "I've heard that cry many times before and since, but nothing like that one." The wounded man had an entreaty and pathos in his voice that would touch a heart of stone. It was maddening. The men all became nervous, would move uneasily about, and tried to keep up conversation, but still that cry rang out. Soon I saw a member of my company spring to his feet, hasten to the rear and fill his canteen from the spring, come back and take off accoutrements. It was Abner Webb. I asked him what he was going to do. He replied, "Captain, I can't stand it any longer. I'm going to take that man a drink if they shoot the hell out of me." And so that's what he does. He grabs a canteen, and Abner Webb rushes over the Union breastworks out into Spangler Meadow to try to give this wounded man who's crying for water a drink. Gardner would write, "The bullets of the enemy fairly rained around him, even though they could plainly see what he had done, giving a man a sip of water. But through the storm of lead he sprang over the works untouched, having done his mission. With a cheery smile on his face, he said, 'Well, I gave him a drink in spite of him.'" And this was republished in the Milwaukee Telegraph in 1885. Webb, that soldier in the 3rd Wisconsin who rushed out into the meadow to give this wounded soldier a drink, would later be wounded at the Battle of Resaca in 1864, but he lived. So the one account I could really find of kind of mercy happening at Spangler Spring was this soldier, Abner Webb, who got shot at for doing what he did by the Confederates who were on the opposite side of the battlefield. So in my mind, this story is much more indicative of what the situation at Spangler Spring was like during the battle. And so I'll conclude, again, by going back to the words of the men that fought there. When these Union soldiers and nurses and historians wrote about the battle on Culp's Hill, they wrote about destruction. They wrote about carnage. They wrote about death. They wrote about the death of innocents. They wrote about human filth. They didn't find anything particularly ennobling in what they did. They didn't write about it in this kind of chivalric terms or tone. But they did, in later years, emphasize how difficult it was for them to forget what they encountered on that hill, as it stuck with them. Charles Morse of the 2nd Massachusetts would write, "As years go by, many of the memories of the war will become dim, and we shall forget the details of some of our campaigns. But the 3 July days at Gettysburg were too grand and impressive never to be forgotten." And perhaps more on the nose, S.R. Norris of the 7th Ohio would write, "As long as reason holds her sway, until all else is forgotten, I shall remember that day and its ghastly dead." And so I'll go back to the words of Bruce Catton in 1962, who was increasingly concerned about the way that Americans are remembering this moment in their national past and painting it with rosy colors rather than looking at it for what it was. "If we are not careful, we may become prisoners of the Civil War, prisoners of its romance, of its legendary, of the odd, heartwarming, and ever-living impulses which its people, its flags, its songs and stories send tingling down the spine. As we proceed, there's grave danger that a sentimental haze will cloud the landscape so that we fail to see the deep, tragic issues and the profound lessons which were involved." I want to thank you all for sticking with me. The subject matter was less than cheery, but I certainly appreciate it. So thank you all for being here today. I'm happy to field any questions if you have them. And if not, thank you all so much. Yeah?
Where are you getting these quotes from the soldiers? What is the source?
The source of the Park Library and Archives. So we have vertical files on every single regiment on both sides of the battle, in which you'll find a variety of accounts that we've been able to gather in the past 75 years since the Park Service has been here. And they range from diaries where soldiers just say, "Hey, July 2nd, woke up at 5, we fought, went to bed," to much more vivid accounts like some of the ones I shared here today. So if you can make an appointment and go dig through them yourself. Yeah. Chokeberries. He describes them as chokeberries.
Sugar.
I'm not a biologist. I'm not a botanist. So beyond that, I'm a bit stymied. I haven't seen them there myself. And I don't believe that, right? I don't believe that this Jessie Young is going and seeing these berries. I'm saying he's seeing berries, but I think the connection between the berries and the death is something that he kind of created. But I think it's more illustrative of his mindset when he goes to the hill in which he's walking around the battlefield, and what he's seeing is not this beautiful kind of pastoral landscape. What he's seeing is that pastoral landscape, but reminding him of the physical carnage that he saw there.
Yeah, kind of like frozen in time.
Kind of. Yeah.
And then the other question I had was, I haven't read any of Bruce Catton's work, so what do you think Catton saw as the deep tragic issues and the profound lessons which are involved?
Sure, and there are a number of them. And if you haven't read Catton, I suggest you do. The Army of the Potomac trilogy is wonderful. Stillness at Appomattox won the Pulitzer Prize just prior to the Centennial. So one, I think what Catton is talking about is the human cost of the war, the physical toll, the death, the destruction, the ugliness of war. Secondly, the issues which propelled the war, slavery, and the role of race in society, I think was what Catton was talking about. And I think also the manner in which the legacies of the war kind of impacted our national society. So reconstruction in the at once optimistic process that then turned into a very ugly process. I think that's what Catton is referring to. He writes a beautiful 3-volume history of the war itself, which is also wonderful. But Catton, out of all the authors I've read, Catton has this, he writes beautifully. He writes beautifully. And he has this wonderful way of taking a relatively small incident or moment or individual and assigning very profound meaning to that moment or situation or individual, which is why I always gravitate towards his writing. I think it's just wonderful. But I think the physical human cost more than anything. Because you got to remember, the Centennial, it's really, in a lot of ways, kind of the birth of reenacting as far as mainstream reenacting, which there's value to, I believe. But on the other hand, it depicts a very kind of sanitized, sterilized view of combat. And I think Catton was disturbed by that to a degree. But I won't speak for Catton anymore.
Yeah. So I understand the first part, I guess, and thanks for giving me the time.
Yeah, of course.
Of what you described as Catton saying about the human cost of battle.
Yeah.
The toll and things like that. The other things, the profound lessons of the deep tragic issues. I can see it becoming like easy to like swing the other way. In other words, from going from a romanticized version,
Yeah.
of the Civil War, swinging too far the other way, where the profound lessons and tragic issues. You see what I'm saying?
I think I do, yeah. I think I do. But there was nothing but death and destruction during the war, and it didn't achieve anything. Is that what you're saying? There was no...
Well, the deep tragic issues and profound lessons were become all there was.
Yes.
The war, and there was no more romance and legendary and legend and odd heartwarming.
Yeah.
But
there weren't those moments, which arguably there were, though perhaps the ratio of one to the other is not quite balanced, maybe when he's writing.
Or who experienced it?
Yeah. That's a fair enough statement. Fair enough statement. That's interesting. Yeah.
What was your source of the Culps film map?
Oh, that's John Batchelder's isometric map of the battlefield. He's a landscape painter more than anything, so he creates this beautiful map of the battlefield, bird's eye view. I think you can buy it at the bookstore, actually. Dates from 1864. He had George Meade sign off on it and everything. But we still actually use that map. It's so accurate. We use it today for our battlefield rehabilitation efforts alongside other maps. Yeah. Batchelder's isometric map. Yes?
Yes, could you refer me to a publication of Bruce Catton's that would focus in on what he felt
start off with Mr. Lincoln's Army, and then follow it up with a book called Glory Road. And you'd be 2/3 of the way through his Army of the Potomac trilogy. Were I you, I'd start with Mr. Lincoln's Army, and then move on. In Mr. Lincoln's Army, he talks about the beginning of the war, the formation of the Army of the Potomac. He spends a great deal of time talking about the Committee on the Conduct of the War that's created. Obviously, a lot of McClellan and kind of the first iteration of the Army of the Potomac, so I would start there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about the disagreement between Geary and Greene about the building of the,
Yeah, sure.
and also did the soldiers recognize at the time the value of those?
I believe they did.
Yeah.
I believe they did. So George Sears Greene, brigade commander, he is a subordinate to Geary, so Geary is his superior officer. And Greene casts a fairly large shadow on the Gettysburg battlefield. Greene is of the opinion that his men should be building these breastworks to defend the hill. Geary, John Geary, who's kind of a towering figure, and he's got a fascinating personal history if you're ever interested in delving into it. He's mayor of San Francisco. He's got this crazy history. Geary is of the opinion that if you allow soldiers to fight behind breastworks or entrenchments, you're going to ruin them, because they're never going to want to fight out in the open again. Does that make sense? So 19th century, mid-19th century Napoleonic tactics, you form up, you're in your ranks, you march out to the enemy, you deliver your fire. Think the fighting at the cornfield, 1862, the Battle of Antietam. Think virtually anything in the Second Manassas Campaign, Fair Oaks, Malvern Hill. This idea that you're moving forward in these long ranks, opening fire on the enemy. That's what Gary's talking about. If you allow men to dig in, you're going to ruin them because they're never going to want to do that again, because it's a whole lot safer to be behind the breastworks. That's what he's saying. And so Geary and Greene have this debate, for lack of a better word, about the value or lack thereof of building breastworks. And Greene obviously was fairly persuasive in his argument, because the entirety of the 12th Army Corps end up building these breastworks. And these are formidable things. There's a beautiful Matthew Brady photograph taken about, kind of on the lower slope of the hill, depicting the nature of these breastworks. I mean, they're fairly robust things. And at one point, Greene even builds a traverse. So this line of works perpendicular to the main line, so that if something happens, his men can fall back to that and have this secondary line of works to fight from. And thank God he did, because they use it on the night of July 2nd. And also, it's I think instructive to go back to the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, in which the 12th Army Corps, they're in some pretty heavy combat. They're in a bad situation. And so I think all of this is informing Greene, who was also, again, an engineer, he's a West Point grad, so he's a guy that's used to building things. And I think, thank goodness they did, because in my opinion, for what it's worth, that is really the difference between victory and defeat on Culps Hill that evening and the next day. It's the value of those breastworks. I hope that makes sense. Well, folks, thank you so much. Oh, one more question. Yeah.
It's Culps Hill, the hill that Lee said take that hill of practical.
He's talking about Cemetery Hill. Cemetery Hill. So that's what he's referring to. Culps Hill, if you take Culps Hill, you take Cemetery Hill too, because Cemetery Hill becomes untenable if you're in the Union Army, if that wooded hill off on its right is occupied. Because that means Baltimore Pike is not really useful to you as an artery anymore. So Union troops leave Culps Hill, Confederates take it, Cemetery Hill's abandoned. But when Lee's talking about take that hill if practicable, he's talking about Cemetery Hill. Folks, thank you all so much. Have a good day. Have a safe day.